Welcome, I'm Darren, and today I'm going to be looking at a very interesting topic, which is what card companies started out as specific card sets. Now, the idea of this came from growing up as a card collector in the 1990s. I was always really proud of the fact that, all the old card sets started out as baseball cards and then got into the other sports, but in the 90s, that was the time for football. And I was very, very confident about that the whole time until actually very recently, like as in weeks ago, when I started to realize, I wonder if that's even true. So I decided to go back and look and really keep tally of how many companies became sports card companies around a specific sport. So the idea is a card company like, say, Collector's Edge, that was designed to be a football card company. The first card set they came out with was football, and they eventually got into like some college stuff, but they were a football card company. That's what they were. There are other cases where a card company may have started out in multiple sports all at one time. They just kind of jumped over and hit everything all at one time. So I'm not really worried about that. What I'm worried about, or what I'm looking at, is how many companies started out as a professional sports card company doing one specific sport, identifying as one sport. And I'm not interested in a card company that started out one year and then merged with another. So Game Day, for instance, in 1992 started off as a football card company, and it remained a football card company, but it did get into other sports. However, in 1993 it joined with Fleer, so it became a part of Fleer. So if a card company starts out and then after 1 year it's gone, or after 1 year it merges with another company, I'm not interested in that. I'm looking for companies that were able to stand alone for at least 2 years, ideally 3 years or more, and that first year was one specific sport. And I also don't want to talk about different brands from the same company. So Fleer is Fleer, Ultra is a part of Fleer, so I'm not concerned about that. Likewise, Upper Deck and SP, I'm not concerned with it, so I'm just looking at the main brand. So those are the main criteria that I have for putting together this list. I'm also looking at professional sports, so I'm not interested in, say, Mother's Cookies, which did do professional cards, but they didn't do official cards. And then a company like Star Picks, they started off doing college cards. They only did college cards, but I'm not interested in amateur cards. I'm looking for only pro cards. So those are the rules. And I'm also looking at the modern era, starting with 1948, basically through the end of the millennium, so through the year 2000, which basically means through the year 1992, because really not much was added after that. So that is the core of what I'm looking at. And I want to start off the list by getting hockey out of the way, because hockey's always been off kind of on its own. It's operated on its own, and there are two card companies that started out in hockey, and they were hockey only. One of them was O-Pee-Chee. Now, O-Pee-Chee eventually would develop a relationship with Topps, so they would also do some baseball cards. But they started off as hockey, and they were, for a large portion of their time, hockey only with some CFL. And the big reason I need to start with O-Pee-Chee is they actually predate the war. So they were making cards in the 30s and then again in the 1960s. So they're actually a little bit of a unique feature in this, because they did exist on both sides. So they're the oldest of all of the sets I'm going to be looking at. But that was created for hockey only. And then likewise in the 1950s, Parkhurst was created for hockey as well. So hockey has two card companies that were made for hockey specifically. Now, Parkhurst started off in 51-52, so it started off in 51, and then in 1952 they did make a CFL set. So it almost convolutes it, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to hockey. I'm going to say, look, in 1951 it came out as a hockey brand, and there was almost nothing that they did in CFL anyway, so it really did count in that way. So that's what you have for hockey. That's all that you have for hockey. So now let's go in and let's look at the three sports that are traditionally understood across the entire country, specifically baseball, football, and basketball. And we got to start, of course, in 1948, because that is basically the year where modern cards was created. And specifically, I'm going to start with Bowman. And Bowman is an important one for me to start with because it also predates the war, in a way. So the war was basically a time where everything got shut down. Even paper had to be rationed, so they didn't make cards during the war. Prior to the war, there were a couple of companies that were making cards. One of those companies was Gum Incorporated, and they made a card set called Playball. And just like O-Pee-Chee, they got shut down for the war, and then after the war, when they came back, the company had changed its name to Bowman. And instead of making a card set called Playball, they made a card set called Bowman. So for me, even though the Playball cards were baseball only, there's too much change that happened in between. So I'm going to look at Bowman as its own distinctive set apart from the play ball. Now I'm going to remember that later on, but that's the criteria I'm going with, is that I don't see a continuity between the two that justifies the two being associated. So in 1948, when Bowman started out, it started out with baseball, but it also started out with football, and it actually started out with basketball as well. So it started out with all three. So it didn't start out as a sport. It started out as sports in general. But it wasn't the only set that started out in 1948. There was another pro set which was created called Leaf. And in 1948, Leaf was a football-only set. True, they made a baseball card, but they didn't release it until 1949, which means that in 1948, Leaf was known as a football card company. And even though they didn't actually realize themselves as a baseball card brand. They weren't identified as a baseball card brand. So oddly enough, and you can put as big of an asterisk next to this as you want, in 1948, Leaf was a football card company first. So here we are at 1948, kicking it off, and already baseball does not have any brand, any company that started out as a baseball card company, but we do have one that started out as a football card company. So it's already starting off to a pretty interesting start. Now, fortunately for baseball, Topps would launch in 1951 as a pro baseball set. The problem is, when you jump back to 1949, football did feature in Topps' first release of cards, which was their felt backs. College football is sports, so that means that Topps was already making sports cards before its first release of a baseball card set. Now, in 48, they had their little magic reveal things, which I don't really consider those to be cards. So it's the Topps felt backs in 1949 that really kind of kicks off Topps. Now, were these to the same level as the 1951 set? No, but Topps was already making sports cards, just not professional sports cards. So I can't give baseball credit for 1951 Topps. Now, I can't give it to football because it wasn't pro football, but Topps only gets half credit, which is basically the same as no credit at all. So Topps did not start off as a baseball card company. It didn't even start off as a pro baseball card company. It had already been making sports cards for a while. Fortunately for baseball, in 1959, Fleer would launch with a Ted Williams set. Again, in 1960, they would make more baseball cards, this time going out and making a whole set, but of legends. In 61, they'd make legends again. It wouldn't be until 1963 that they would make a full set of current baseball players. The problem is, in 1960, they did make a professional football card set. In fact, in 1961, they would make a professional basketball set before they made their first professional baseball set. And that's the problem, is the 1959 Ted Williams set was really a novelty set. Was it related to sports? Sure. But it was a novelty set. It wasn't a true pro baseball set. So for baseball, Fleer doesn't count as a professional baseball card brand because they were making professional football cards before, but they were making a sports card, novelty set, sure, but they were making a sports card before they made the professional football set. So that means that Fleer also, it gives half credit to football, but that's about it. So here we are now to the 1960s, and there's still no company in the modern era that started out as a baseball card company. And things would get a bit worse for baseball because in 1964, Philadelphia Gum would launch their own card set, which for 4 years made only football. That's it. So that means that by the end of the 1960s, hockey has 2 card companies that started as hockey cards. Football has 2 card companies that started as football card companies. Baseball, no card company started as a baseball card company. Likewise with basketball. So that's a pretty long shot. And then you got to jump ahead through the 1970s because Topps had this stranglehold over the entire industry. It's not until 1981 when Fleer reemerged as a baseball card company, actually able to compete head to head. Now, obviously, we've already established that Fleer already had its start, so 1981 wouldn't count. But here's what's really interesting about 81. Prior to this, there had been 1 baseball set, and there had been 1 basketball set. They'd made as many pro baseball sets as pro basketball sets. Football, they made 4 pro football sets. Plus, for over half a decade in the 1970s, they had been making Fleer action cards for football with a contract with the NFL properties, which means they were through and through a football card company before they became one of the 3 baseball card companies in the 1980s. So baseball's really at a disadvantage here. Fortunately for baseball, in 1981, Don Russ would kick off as a baseball card company. Now, I'm not going to count Leaf, but baseball's still not off the hook because in 1981, Don Russ also made a pro golf set, which means even Don Russ didn't start off truly as a baseball set. It started off as a 2-sport company, so guess what? Baseball would have to wait until 1986 with Sportflix to finally get the first set, the first company that started off as a baseball card company. Now, about this time, Classic also got started, and they were making cards of professional baseball players, but they weren't professional baseball cards. They were a set, you bought it as a complete set, and it was a game. They had almost nothing on the cards related to the players. So that really doesn't count as a set, so Classic doesn't even count. So in 1986, you had Sportflix, and then 2 years later, in 1988, Score was created, and that was created as a baseball card. Now, I'm not concerned about the relationship between Score and Sportflix because just like Bowman and Playball, to me they're kind of distinctive. So that means that by 1988, baseball had finally caught up with football for the number of card companies that started out as a baseball card company as opposed to a football card company. In 1989, we would see the addition of Upper Deck for baseball. We would also see the addition of Pro Set for football. And in basketball, they would get their first and only edition of NBA Hoops. That was the only time that a card company was created for basketball. Now, Skybox would show up as well the next year, but the relationship between them is too tied. So NBA Hoops is basically it for basketball. So for 2 years, 1988 and 1989, baseball had as many card companies that had started out as baseball cards as football. And in 1990, that would change because Action Packed would join the scene for football, and that was the launch of football would just pull away. In 1991, football saw the addition of Wild Card and Pro Line. Now, Pacific also joined, but it had started off doing baseball legends, football legends, it had done some Seahawks cards, it had quite a history beforehand. So I'm not going to count that, but the 2 of Wild Card and Pro Line were added in 1991. 1992 saw Collector's Edge and Playoff. So that means that football pulled ahead with 5 individual card companies that started off as football cards, clear away from everything else. And that was basically it. You know, you'd have Ted Williams cards. Well, Ted Williams didn't do any of the pro players, so that's the second time that Ted Williams let baseball cards down. You had All World, but All World had kind of been around. You had Ultimate with WLAF, but that was like a 1-year affair. Really, there wasn't a lot else that happened. So that is basically, in the modern era, that's basically all the card companies that were created. And it's interesting to look at the final tally where you have 1 basketball card company, 2 hockey card companies, 3 baseball card companies, and 4 times 2 football card companies. 8 football card companies. There are 5 more card companies for football than had been created for baseball. So for me, it was really a shock, primarily the fact that in the modern era, from 1948 through 1985, no card companies had been created as baseball card companies. 86 was the first time that would happen. Now, if you want to go before the war, that's a totally different story. It's almost all baseball and boxing. But it's kind of a revelation to look at that and see just how post-war football has always been kind of the innovative sport. That's been the area where all of the strange, interesting, exciting stuff has been happening. And basketball would kind of take on that mantle in the late 90s. I mean, it was kind of between the two. But yeah, baseball, surprisingly enough, it was not the de facto way back even by 1948. I thought that was really kind of fascinating. I thought you guys might like to see that. So let me know your thoughts if you think that I was fair in terms of how I structured that. And check out my other videos if you haven't gotten a chance. Thank you very much for watching.